World War II has come to a close. The Nazis are victorious, yet their reign of destruction and terror is not over. The Nazis have secret plans to eradicate religion, revive long-extinct species, and eventually conquer the entire world. One of the weirdest plans the Nazis had in store for after World War II was bringing back extinct species. Nazi scientists were doing all kinds of crazy experiments. They were also committing countless crimes against humanity, which would obviously be a key aspect of their post-war plans as well. But the Nazis had been working on some pretty wild ideas that were not based around mass genocide. One such experiment was to bring an ancient giant cow back from extinction. The Nazis had bioengineers working on a way to bring back a variety of extinct species. One of the organisms they hoped to return to Earth was the auroch. This was an ancient cow that could weigh over 3,000 pounds. That's about 1,000 pounds heavier than the average cow today. Just think about how much steak that would be. The Nazis may have been trying to bring back the auroch as a food source that would feed their growing Aryan population. However, the Nazis were conducting all kinds of crazy experiments, so bringing back long-extinct species may have had a more sinister purpose than just creating a viable food source. We're not saying the Nazis were trying to bring back a T-Rex to fight on their side, but we wouldn't put it past them either. In reality, the Nazis did not win World War II, but if they had, things would be very different. If they secured victory and were allowed to carry out their post-war secret plans, you probably wouldn't be here right now. This is because, like most people, you're probably not 100% Aryan. But how would this nightmare scenario of a Nazi-run world have even been possible? In 1940, a Nazi victory looked like a real possibility. The British government even discussed making peace with Germany as the Nazi war machine swept across Europe. But Hitler made a series of mistakes that would eventually lead to his downfall. The decision to invade the Soviet Union and fight a war on multiple fronts was eventually the Nazis' undoing. Their forces were spread too thin, and once the United States joined the war, the Allies had the men and resources needed to push back the Germans. If Hitler had maintained his focus on Europe and kept the United States out of the war, the Nazis could have won and set their next plans into motion. But what would the Nazis have done with their newfound power? And what horrors awaited the rest of the world? Once the Nazis conquered Western Europe and Britain, they would begin to set up a defensive border on the east. Then, the first series of post-war plans could begin. The Nazis would start by annexing the lands in the surrounding region. This would mostly consist of Nordic territories, which contained peoples who the Nazis considered suitable to add to their Aryan Empire. The rest of the world would slowly be divided up among the Nazi allies for the time being. It's likely that the Nazis would claim half of the Soviet Union as their own for its resources and forced labor, while the rest of the massive country was given to Japan. Hitler had plans for the rest of the world, but first he would need to take inventory of his spoils. Once lands had been consolidated between the Nazis and their allies, it would be time for the next war. In fact, if the Nazis had won World War II, their plan was to never actually stop fighting. They would control the entire world or die trying. Regardless of whether these Nazi intentions were supposed to be secret or not, the whole world knew that if Germany was victorious in World War II, it was only a matter of time until they started their next campaign. Hitler and the Nazis were never going to be happy with just conquering Europe. Basically, the plan was that once the land was divided up amongst the Axis powers, there would be a momentary peace, but it wouldn't last forever. East Asia would still need to be completely subdued, and although Japan was mainly responsible for this operation, the Nazis knew that they would eventually need to send forces deeper into Asia. There was also the continent of Africa, which contained resources that the new Nazi empire would need to sustain itself. Many of the Afrikaners of South Africa may have been easily persuaded to join the Nazi ranks, as they already held deeply racist beliefs about the indigenous peoples of the region. This would give the Nazis a foothold in southern Africa, which they could use to their advantage. And since at that point the armies of Britain and other colonial powers in Africa would have already been defeated, all the Nazis had to do was send in military forces to squash any remaining resistance and subjugate the people of the continent. Unfortunately, if the Nazis had been victorious, this plan may have culminated in the people of Africa being forced into slavery or annihilated by the new rulers, since they did not meet the requirements of the Aryan race. As the post-war plans of the Nazis unfolded, there would be one main force of resistance left to deal with: the United States. During the war, Hitler was extremely vocal about his doubtfulness that the United States would last as a nation. He saw the country as teetering on the edge of chaos. Due to its mix of ethnicities and cultures, Hitler believed the country would implode in on itself. Hitler firmly held the idea that there could be no peace between the different races, and that his hierarchy with Aryans at the top was the only way humanity could exist. Obviously, this isn't true. But Hitler's plan was to make peace with the US and just wait patiently for the country to descend into chaos. If that didn't happen by the time Nazis had conquered the rest of the world, Hitler was more than happy to send forces to the Americas and invade the United States. This couldn't happen, until he controlled the resources of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But in the Nazi post-war plan, it was only a matter of time until they controlled these continents. Although the fact that the United States had already developed aircraft with powerful bombing capabilities as well as the nuclear bomb may have forced the Nazis to deal with the US threat sooner rather than later. And this brings us to the part of the secret post-war plan that wasn't much of a secret. If the Nazis had won the war, they would have continued their genocidal acts against the Jewish people and anyone else who did not fit their Aryan mold. One of the main goals for the post-war Nazi Empire was to completely eradicate the Jewish population from the face of the earth. However, they didn't want to just stop there. The Nazis would have continued rounding up and killing any peoples who would not further the Aryan race, which pretty much consisted of everyone who lived outside of Europe. This probably made their Japanese allies a little wary. If the Nazis did win, it was only a matter of time before they came to wipe out the Asian people and replace them with Aryans. Which brings us to one of the craziest secret plans the Nazis had for after the war. Even as the battles of World War II were raging on, the Nazis created the Lebensborn baby factories. These were basically facilities where babies of Aryan parents would be born and raised. This was done to make sure there was a constant supply of Aryan children to join the ranks of the Nazis and conquer the world. The Lebensborn programs did not just breed Aryan babies in captivity, however, it also stole babies from other countries. It's estimated that around 100,000 children were stolen from Polish families during the war and put in the Nazi facilities. Nazi soldiers were also encouraged to find and mate with European women who had Aryan characteristics. This happened with or without the woman's consent. After the war, the Nazis would need to ramp up the program to repopulate the world as they continued to commit mass genocide wherever they went. But stealing babies could only get the Lebensborn program so far. During the war, there was a major obstacle in Hitler's way to creating his master race, the Christian Church. Hitler and other leaders of the Nazi Party wanted to dismantle Christianity, and there were a few reasons for this. But one of the main ones was they needed to create a large Aryan population quickly. In the monogamous relationships that people who belonged to the Catholic and Protestant faiths engaged in, ramping up population growth was difficult. Hitler encouraged Nazi men to be polygamous. In fact, after the war, the Nazis were planning on imposing a state policy that required Nazi men to impregnate as many women as possible to keep the population growing. In order for this new state-sanctioned polygamy to be taken seriously, the Nazis needed to get rid of the Christian Church. And that was not the only reason why post-war Germany wanted to dismantle this religious institution. The morality of what the Nazis were doing was questioned by the heads of the church. Getting into heaven, if you were engaged in mass genocide, was just not something many Christian leaders were willing to get behind. Therefore, the principles of the Nazi Party and the church could not be reconciled. Since the conflict with the church was inevitable, the Nazis planned to get rid of it altogether. Hitler Youth were indoctrinated to the belief that the National Socialist movement and the church could not coexist, and so one of them had to go. And if the Nazis had won World War II, their plan was to eradicate the Christian religion. The secret plan was actually sped up slightly when in 1943 the Vatican spoke out against Hitler and the Nazis and the atrocities they were committing. The Nazis tried to sneak into the Vatican City to assassinate the Pope but did not succeed. Someone tipped off the Vatican officials and the Pope was snuck out before he could be kidnapped or eliminated. If the Nazis had won World War II, the fate of the Catholic Church would have not been pleasant. In fact, the Nazi post-war plan was to get rid of all organized religion and make this state the only thing people believed in. Hitler and the Nazi leadership planned to put themselves on a pedestal comparable to God, and everyone in their new empire would be required to worship and devote their lives to them. Nazi plans after World War II started with regrouping their force and then removing any further opposition to them in Europe. This included the Christian religion. Then the Nazis would sweep across the rest of the world, eliminating or subjugating other ethnicities. The end goal, which wasn't much of a secret, was to create a world where the Aryan race ruled and made up the majority of the population. That being said, even if the Nazis had won World War II and carried out their crazy secret plans for world domination, they may have been destroyed by an unseen force. The breeding of genetically similar people to create more genetically similar people can lead to problems. One example of this can actually be seen in the descendants of the Afrikaner population today. This population tends to have a higher percentage of individuals with Huntington's disease than the rest of the world. This is due to a relatively small group of people reproducing with one another without introducing much variation into the gene pool. A similar thing might have happened as a result of the Nazis' plans to create a population of Aryans to spread across the world. The lack of genetic diversity could have led to higher rates of mutations and disease. So this part of the Nazi secret plans for after World War II may have actually ended up being their downfall. Now watch what actually happened to Nazi leaders after World War II, or check out Sewing Twins: Nazi Camp Experiments.